What is up, you guys? Welcome to the Fundamental Health Podcast. As many of you know, uh, my Instagram got shut down this week. Hopefully, we'll get it back soon. But if you're looking for Carnivore MD on Instagram, you're not seeing me there. It's not because I blocked you. It's because the Instagram overlords decided that they didn't want me to mention things about COVID or whatever. So that's frustrating. But we're taking it all in stride, and hopefully, it'll be back soon. I still am loving Whole Package. I am loving this supplement that we've got from Heart and Soil Supplements. This is the company that I built in Austin, Texas, that helps all of you get more nose to tail nutrition. And I'm so proud of what we are doing. It is just an incredible group of people here. Really, we are sourcing the best grass-fed, grass-finished organs on the planet, putting them into capsules for you to help you get all of the unique nutrition from these. That's difficult to get from organs. And I'm a huge fan of eating nose to tail. I'm a huge fan of eating animal foods. All of you know that I believe these are really the center of human health. These are the most sought out foods our ancestors and currently living hunter gatherers have ever been in search of, and they lead to abundant health for us. So we want to help you reclaim your birthright to radical health at Heart and Soil. You can find us at heartandsoil.co. And I am completely convinced that getting more organs in your life will be a huge benefit to you. I want to read you a review from Catherine G about our histamine and immune product. She says, I started developing seasonal allergies in my 20s after going through cancer treatments. I always needed Zyrtec and Benadryl, which was expensive and not a healthy option long-term. Started using histamine and immune. I don't need any allergy meds anymore, even with the seasons changing, and have my windows open 24/7. I can even stay indoors in rooms where there are fresh cut lilies. I used to get debilitating headaches if I got anywhere near them. I'm not even worked up to the full dose yet, so I'm really pleased. How cool is that, you guys? Like histamine and immune, amazing. Here's another review about histamine and immune. This one is crushing it right now. This is from Eric. He says, I absolutely swear by histamine and immune. Last year, I developed the worst allergies I've ever experienced. Pets I've been around for years were all of a sudden giving me hour-long allergy attacks. Hiking trails I've been doing for ages would have me sneezing and itching for hours afterward. It sucked. After finding Paul through some online research, I switched to an all animal-based diet. And along with that, I ordered histamine and immune from Heart and Soil. Within what seemed to be weeks, my body stopped having adverse reactions to animals in nature, just like that. I love this stuff and beyond grateful for the work that Paul and Heart and Soil do. So that's from Eric. So check us out, heartandsoil.co, and reclaim your birthright to radical health, you guys. Now, my guest on this week's podcast is Stephan Van Vliet. As you'll hear in the beginning of the podcast, I just butchered his name all the time, but I think I'm getting it reasonably right. He earned his PhD in Kinesiology and Community Health as an ESPEN Fellow from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, received post-doctoral training at the Center for Human Nutrition in the Washington University School of Medicine in St. Louis. Dr. Van Vliet also holds a master's in nutrition science. He is currently a member of the Duke Molecular Physiology Institute within the Duke School of Medicine, focuses his work on the effects of primary compounds, protein, carbohydrates, fat, and vitamins, and secondary compounds, phytochemicals, polyphenols, quote unquote, antioxidants, and the molecular mechanisms by which they impact human metabolism. His work also involves physical activity interventions and utilizes an integrative approach to improve human health. I first became aware of Stephan's work when I read some of his papers in conjunction with Fred Provenza, and the fact that he's doing work looking at the effects of meat in a human diet that is a whole foods diet rather than a standard American garbage processed diet. This is one of my favorite conversations ever. I think it will really be eye-opening for you. In the conversation, I talk about the way that my views on this have changed a little bit, and you will hear how what a cow eats is really important in terms of you getting the right nutrition out of that meat, and how you can marinate meat from the inside out by eating a grass-fed, grass-finished, regeneratively raised cow. So I love this stuff, and organs. And yet another reason to get organs in your diet, like we make it Heart and Soil. So I love this stuff. This was a fascinating conversation. I know you guys are going to really like it. If you appreciate this podcast, please leave me a review wherever you listen. If you happen to listen on Apple Podcasts, I especially appreciate that one. And I will give away a signed copy of my book every month to someone who leaves me a review there. It helps us reach more people. And ultimately, that is what makes me feel like we are succeeding in this movement. One person at a time, but lives are changing. In fact, I was in the grocery store today in Whole Foods in Austin, and somebody came up to me and said, man, your work changed my life. He was from the VA. He was in the military. He was worried about his LDL being high. And it just made me feel so good. I mean, I nearly started crying. I just wanted to thank him for telling me that, because this is hard work to do. Instagram shuts down my shit. People criticize you all the time. It's awesome to see that people are really, really benefiting from what we're doing. And I hope this conversation will also help people understand where we're coming from. So thank you for all your support. And please leave me a review on Apple Podcasts if you can. Enjoy it. Stay radical. Thanks for coming on the podcast, my friend. It's good to have you here.
Thank you, Paul. I'm happy to be here, and thank you for having me.
Yeah, so how do I say your last name? Is it Van Vliet?
It's Van Vliet, yes.
Okay.
That's
and
right.
Is it Stephan or Stephen? Stephan?
Stephan, yes.
Okay. And is it French? What is your ethnicity?
No, I'm originally born and raised in the Netherlands, in Rotterdam, a big city that used to, in the 90s, boasted the biggest harbor in the world. But so I grew up near the North Sea.
Okay, interesting. I've never been to the Netherlands, but I want to get to that area of the world soon. I'm fascinated by kind of like the northern European countries, but it's great to have you because I really appreciate the research you're doing and the way that you're looking at this stuff. And I think that my audience is really going to appreciate some of these conversations today. We're going to address a lot of topics that I've kind of touched upon in the past, but it's always good to hear about them again. And I'm sure your perspective will be unique and we'll probably dive a little deeper than I have in the past. But I thought we would start with some discussion of, there's a CNN report that I saw recently, which just really epitomizes what frustrates probably both of us about mainstream health reporting these days. And the CNN report was that eating one hot dog shortens your life by 30. So, of course, I don't even understand why plant-based advocates or vegan doctors on Instagram fall for this type of stuff, but they were reposting and it's saying, haha, look, meat is not good for you, it shortens your life. Of course, I'm sure that most of my audience was savvy enough to realize this is observational epidemiology. But, I was reading one of your papers, and we're going to go through a bunch of the papers that you've written in this podcast. And you wrote a great paper that I thought had so many interesting points that we'll touch on. And the title of that one is Plant-Based Meats, Human Health, and Climate Change. And at the beginning of this paper, you make this really interesting point that there are studies that have been done, both epidemiological and I should say observational and interventional, in which red meat has been included as part of a quote-unquote healthy diet versus a standard American diet. And I thought maybe we could go through some of those and talk about what you think about this CNN report on this observational study that hot dogs shorten your life for 36 minutes. And maybe we can break down some of these studies in the paper. I've got them pulled up if you want to look at them and talk about the contrast, what we know at this moment, and then maybe we'll get into the research you're doing and contrast the way that red meat appears to behave, or at least the pretty significant evidence that red meat, healthy diet, doesn't look like we're often told it does.
Yeah, no, you're right, Paul. The short end of it is that indeed the background diet in which individual foods are consumed, whether it be red meat or any other food, is obviously going to have a major impact if whether that individual food would associate with health and disease. And I would argue that the overall diet is going to have a far more dramatic effect on that. But yeah, in this study, and I wrote this with, so I really wrote the human nutrition part, and it's together with Scott Kronberg and Fred Provenza, which are agricultural scientists. So we were merging both the nutrition as well as the environmental piece, which seem sometimes synonymous now these days when you talk about red meat and human health. So that's really what we did in that paper. And indeed, what as you alluded to, the CNN headline was probably the study taken a little bit too far, just because you can make an estimate of how long it would take. It's obviously a lot of uncertainty. No one in nutrition science has that type of precision to say that eating a hot dog shortens your life by 36 minutes and eating an almond or a handful of almonds increases it by 24 minutes or something like that, which I saw that on social media, and a lot of people were obviously saying, what if I eat some salmon with almonds and a hot dog, and then it will cancel everything out and I'll still be 2 minutes up. But yeah, obviously it's not that simple. And of course, I think the observational studies have a place, but it was interesting to see that there was actual minutes given to individual foods.
So why are studies like this, from your perspective, misleading? What's going on here? How can they do a study like this and find, and even make a claim like eating a hot dog is associated with 36 minutes shorter life? Like, why is this so misleading to the consumer?
Well, yeah, I wouldn't say it's misleading per se. I mean, obviously, I think the scientist meant well, and of course, but yeah, I mean, I think we also have to be careful, and as a scientist, we also have a role in that. It's and certainly, I also have to be introspective too. It's important that we do not overplay our data, and be sure that we are sure to point out some of these caveats. And I do know it's sometimes hard as a researcher, because I've definitely also published work, and then the media runs with it and takes one piece out of it, right? Depending on what you want to take out of it. But yeah, for the consumer, it's obviously very confusing, because a lot of these nuances, again, is that, for instance, as we can go into, is that usually the headlines that, for instance, say red meat is associated with cancer, heart disease, etc. Quite often, it misses the nuance of the population that was studied, or the overall lifestyle. The other day, I commented on this on social media, on Twitter too. There was a study that found, I think, a 20% increase in cardiovascular disease with red meat. But the relationship was completely dissolved when accounting for BMI. And the authors did a good job in stating that, but the news headline did not do a good job in stating that, because what it essentially found is that people with a higher BMI were at risk of developing metabolic disease, and the people that ate red meat with a low BMI and as part of a healthy lifestyle had no increased risk of developing metabolic disease, such as, in this case, cardiovascular disease. And those are the nuances that are often missed in news reporting, and why it's so confusing for the consumer to one day read a news report saying red meat is bad for our health, and the other day might read a news report saying, well, red meat is okay for our health. And especially the eggs are also plagued by this, right? Where 1 week the consumer might read eggs are bad for you, the next week they're okay. And what it usually boils down to quite often is the dose, of course, but I'd say more importantly, the overall dietary background in which it's consumed. If you consume your eggs as an egg muffin with a bunch of other ultra-processed foods, or you consume your eggs as part of a more wholesome diet, that will modify the associations that eggs or otherwise red meat too have with disease outcome.
And this is the problem with observational studies, and hopefully everyone listening to this understands that these are not studies where there's an actual control group and an experiment, usually, but it's a group of people who tend to associate behaviors, and they're saying, how much meat or how many eggs do you eat? And as you point out, sometimes there are people who are more obese who end up eating more meat because of this unhealthy user bias that we've been subject to for the last 70 plus years, because the mainstream narrative has been that meat is unhealthy for us. And so the phrase that I've been mentioning to people, or the question I've been asking people is, outside of your community of people who are outliers and are health conscious, in the general United States population or the general westernized population, how often do you see someone go to McDonald's and eat meat? Never. They always eat a hamburger with a bun and special sauce, which has seed oils, and French fries, which are cooked in soybean oil, along with a milkshake with a bunch of processed sugar, and probably a soft serve ice cream at the end with a cone. And so this is why I think it's so misleading that these studies even get published or talked about in the media. And I really appreciated what you said in your paper, which was that there are many studies which have been done. Maybe we can go through some of these. There are many studies which have been done that looked at the consumption of red meat in the context of a quote-unquote high-quality omnivorous diet, and they did not find the same results.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely been some studies. I would say just by nature, most of the studies have been done in people on standard American diets, arguably because that's what most of us are consuming, right? About 60 or about 2/3 of our diet is made up of ultra-processed foods in the standard American diet. So by default, you're gonna probably end up with a lot of studies that are done on that population, right? But there have certainly been studies like the Alberta Stamara project is one that comes to mind, that where people had I want to say it was over a pound or a pound and a half of meat a week, but also when co-consumed with a lot of fruits and vegetables, the association with cancer went from a positive association to a at least non-significant relative risk of, I think it was about 0.78 or 0.8 or something like that. But in any case, the point being is that when co-consumed as part of a high-quality diet, in this case rich in fruits and vegetables, the association was flip-flopped. It went from a protective one to a neutral one, and potentially protective one. And other studies have found this too, like the Oxford EPIC study, the Healthy Shopper study, the 45 and up study. Essentially what many of these studies found is that when red meat is consumed as part of a healthy diet, that a lot of these associations with increased risk of metabolic disease may disappear. So there's certainly been some research done in this area. I agree, we need more studies on this. Also, it will be important to do some more prospective studies, randomized controlled trials to either to study these potential associations prospectively. But also a few studies that pop to mind is the consumption of beef as part of a DASH diet, which is also considered a healthy diet, rich in fruits and vegetables, whole grains. I mean, low in ultra-processed foods, essentially. The DASH diet, also a Mediterranean diet, and their inclusion of beef at least does not seem to be reducing health biomarkers, in this case looking at triglycerides and cholesterol levels, and we can argue whether that's always the best metric, but also inflammatory profiles such as interleukin-6 and C-reactive protein, which is not increased when meat is co-consumed as part of fruits and vegetables. And we go into the mechanism why, and it's a little bit of speculation because we need to do more work on it in humans, but it does seem that there's at least some mechanistic insight that when red meat is consumed as part of ultra-processed foods, that maybe some of the potential carcinogens in meat could become an issue, whereas if you add herbs and spices and marinades the meat, that some of these the formation of these compounds are pretty much canceled out, and that could be a potential mechanistic explanation to that.
I think there's a lot of potential hypotheses there which we can address. Before we do that, I just want to show people some of the studies that you were mentioning. I've talked about these in the past, but this is the UK Shopper study, the Mortality in British Vegetarians, a review and preliminary results from the EPIC Oxford cohort. And as you can see here, the mortality of both vegetarians and non-vegetarians in these studies is low compared with the national rates. Within studies, the mortality for major causes of death was not significantly different between vegetarians and non-vegetarians. And that's essentially because they were looking at a population of people who were non-vegetarians, these are omnivores, who had quote-unquote healthy behaviors. This is a study I've talked about in the past. I think you might have mentioned this one. This is the meat consumption and diet quality and mortality in NHANES 3. And you can see the conclusions here. Meat consumption was not associated with mortality. A healthy diet, according to HEI, however, was associated with a decreased total mortality in men but not women. And this is people, again, these are observational trials, but these are people eating meat in the context of a, quote, healthy diet according to HEI, which is the Healthy Eating Index. It's some sort of a metric that accounts for the presence of processed food and the presence of things like, quote unquote, fruits and vegetables, which are often associated with a healthy diet. This is a really big one that I've talked about in the past. meat intake and cause-specific mortality, pooled analysis of Asian prospective cohort studies. I mean, hundreds of thousands of people in Asia, where I would argue the narrative is completely different than it is in the West. And they found that the most red meat consumption was associated with the lowest incidence of cardiovascular mortality in men and the lowest incidence of cancer mortality in women. This one is particularly interesting.
I do think, Paul, with that study on the Asians, I do think it's important to point out, and you might know these numbers off the top of my head because I haven't looked at the study specifically, but I do believe in the highest category of consumers, Asian consumers, I do believe it still is fairly moderate in terms of Western consumption patterns. So I think that, when you look at actually their highest intake is not our highest intake, right? It's that their intake is a little lower. So that is important to note. But it is indeed, as you point out here, it could indeed be associated with more affluence, better socioeconomic status, and things like that. But yeah, absolutely. It's this study at least shows that this would be constituted moderate intake probably in the American diet, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay. This is the DASH study that you mentioned, the effects of a DASH-like diet containing lean beef on vascular health. Very interesting to note that there were no significant effects of the dietary treatments on diastolic blood pressure or endothelial function, as measured by peripheral arterial tonometry. Moderate protein DASH-like diet, including lean beef, decreased systolic blood pressure in normotensive individuals. They say the inclusion of lean beef in a heart-healthy diet also reduced peripheral vascular constriction. So this is to get kind of fascinating, and these are not the type of study that I would design if I had my druthers, but a lot of information. And the last one that I'll show here is the Mediterranean one you mentioned. The Mediterranean style eating pattern, processed red meat, has cardiometabolic benefits for adults who are overweight or obese. And this one is a randomized crossover feeding trial. The other ones were, many of them were observational trials. But as you can see here, adults who are overweight or moderately obese may improve multiple cardiometabolic risk factors by adopting a quote-unquote Mediterranean style with or without reductions in red meat intake. Meats are lean and unprocessed. In this trial, I should note that the non-reduced red meat consumption group had 100 grams of red meat per week, and the reduced red meat consumption group had 200 grams of red meat per week. Now, I'll be perfectly honest and point out that I eat 500 grams of red meat in one sitting, and one week, and we can talk about what that might mean. So there's a lot to go one level deeper here, if it's okay with you. I will refer people back to the podcast I did with Tucker Goodrich and the Diet Lyon heart study, in which they sort of created a framework for what we consider to be a Mediterranean diet pattern. And generally, a Mediterranean diet pattern, there's no real consensus on this, but it's thought of as a dietary pattern that has higher levels of things like alpha-linolenic acid and lower levels of linoleic acid. So the context here in that study is at least, hey, we're going to reduce linoleic acid and give these people moderate amounts of red meat, and hey, that doesn't hurt them, no surprise there. But the question that I have for you, Stephan, is, there's two questions here. Let's address the first one, which is, it is about ultra-processed foods that make them so harmful for humans. Because I think that we can agree that the absence of ultra-processed foods is a huge variable in these diets. And there is a pretty clear signal here that when you remove ultra-processed foods, the inclusion of, at least from these studies, moderate amounts of red meat, maybe not Paul's amounts of red meat, but moderate amounts of red meat appear to even be beneficial for humans. So what do you think it is about ultra-processed foods that we're dealing with here?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. The simplest answer is what Kevin Hall's studies shown is that people tend to overeat on ultra-processed foods too. So you end up with 500 extra calories, and there's certainly some mechanistic insight on why it is, but you probably don't have your normal satiety responses. You end up with usually getting a lot of energy in actually a small volume of food already. You are not potentially getting some of the nutrients, and you especially see this in animal models, is that let's say if we eat a strawberry, or in this case me, but let's take the strawberry as the example. Let's say if we eat a strawberry and we get we have a sweetness, and we like eating that, but we also get the nutrients with it, right? So it's nourishing and it's satiating. But if you have a strawberry gusher, then you don't get the nutrients with it. So in animal models, you definitely see that if you have a calorie-rich diet, but which are at the same time nutrient poor, is that animals tend to overeat to try to obtain these nutrients. Perhaps there's no reason there. This could happen in humans too, obviously. I mean, clearly you see the overeating, and we do this in a randomized controlled trial now too, where we're looking at red meat as part of a ultra-processed diet and more of a healthful traditional American diet. It's very hard to keep people to not overeat, or at least with the whole foods diet, matching that in calories in the ultra-processed diet. A lot of people I started to understand why people probably stay lean on a whole foods diet, because it's just very hard to overeat on that too, and that's something we've noticed too. So the overeating part is one thing. The digestion absorption kinetics are altered, so you may get these nutrients that come into circulation much quicker, so the satiety responses are off. Could it be the types of fatty acids? Potentially, but it could also just be these come with in an ultra processed package, right? So that I don't know if we can truly decouple that. Things like sugar and types of fatty acids, can we truly uncouple that from the food sources in which they come in? That's I think a tricky part, and we can go into that or not. But the short end of it is that, yeah, ultra-processed foods, they are typically also lower in what we think of like secondary compounds due to the processing. So a lot of secondary metabolites are processed out, such as certain phytochemical compounds, which are being processed out or occur in lower amounts. So these could all be reasons why ultra-processed foods are particularly harmful for our health, and why consuming the same types of foods is more wholesome as part of a wholesome diet could potentially offset some of that.
So I referred back to this podcast a moment ago, but I did a podcast recently with Tucker Goodrich, and we talked about this. There's a pretty clear mechanism for overconsumption of ultra-processed foods, connecting linoleic acid with endogenous anandamides, or the overproduction of endogenous anandamides. These, in this case, I think would be, exogenous, essentially, because it's coming from linoleic acid, but things like 2-AG and anandamide. And that's been worked out pretty well. I think that's a pretty fascinating thing. And it connects also with the drug rimonabant, which is a cannabinoid 1 receptor antagonist that's pretty clearly shown to abrogate appetite by blocking the CB1 receptor, and, potentially by blocking these cannabinoids from the overconsumption of, I would say, evolutionarily inconsistent levels of linoleic acid. So that's quite interesting to me. But you bring up this other point, which I really appreciate about your research, and I think this gets to a really key concept that I wanted to make sure we flesh out in this podcast, which is the concept of a food matrix and the whole food matrix. And this is perpetually frustrating for me, that in nutrition science, people often conflate reductionist experiments with foods or food components that are not done in a whole food matrix with foods that occur in a whole food matrix. And there's plenty of examples of this, but you mentioned strawberries versus just pure fructose or sucrose in table sugar, or high fructose corn syrup would be an analogy here. And so this is super frustrating for me that in the literature, there's a decent body of literature saying that, hey, if you overfeed humans or rats pure fructose, that looks to have negative metabolic effects on humans. But that never occurs unless we're eating processed food, unless we're eating diet, not diet, but like Coca-Cola with high fructose corn syrup, right? And so, but my concern is that people in certain nutritional communities will conflate that and say, oh, fruit is not good for humans, or honey, is not good for humans, when in fact we have research to suggest the opposite. So do you have the same sort of frustration? Does that make sense, what I'm expressing?
Yeah, no, I agree with you, Paul. We have to be careful that indeed in nutritional reductionism has a place to sort of try to understand certain mechanisms. But yeah, when we start to think that, overfeeding of fructose induces fatty liver disease, and then start to extrapolate that to say like, we shouldn't eat an apple or have a tablespoon of honey, then I think we're missing the point there. So I would definitely agree with that. And you do see that when these things are fed in like a whole food matrix, you do see that the associative data changes typically, right? A can of a sugar-sweetened beverage like Coke is not the same as getting your fructose from sweet potato. One thing we're doing in the study now is like we try to match the sugar content. Well, that's hard to do, but we give people a lot of sweet potato, right? Sweet potato is pretty high in sugar and in glucose, but obviously it's going to be different than getting it from other like added sugars and things like that. And I mean, I don't challenge us or me that a sweet potato is unhealthy because it contains sugar, or that an apple is unhealthy because it contains sugar, right? So I think those are important nuances to, well, maybe some people do, but I think we have a pretty strong body. I'm not always sure about a lot of things in science, but that I feel pretty comfortable in saying that that can be part of a diet. So I think I agree with that. Those are such important nuances, and they are sometimes overlooked when we equate single nutrients, which we typically do, like sugar, saturated, even sometimes protein, like high intakes of those, that we sort of equate that and then say that, then food sources that contain these nutrients are not good for us, whereas it's much more nuanced than that, and the matrix in which you consume individual nutrients is going to have an impact on how your body metabolizes this and health outcomes. So
exactly, and this is something that I think is perpetually lost in the nutrition sphere, because it's very difficult to study things in a whole food matrix, and that's why I appreciate your perspective on this and some of the research you're doing. I want to get more into the actual studies you're doing now. But I mean, I had a previous podcast with Stephen Gundry, and we had a little debate about fructose, and he's always sending me papers about fructose in isolation, and I'm always saying back to him, show me a paper that shows that fruit with fructose is bad for humans, and he's been unable to do that. So this is just, you said I don't think anyone would debate us, and I would say, oh yes, actually people do debate this very frequently, that fructose is fructose. And in the world of nutritional science or nutritional, Twitter or nutritional medicine in general, I think that everyone, or mostly everyone, is well intentioned, but there are a lot of people in the ketogenic community who get very zealous and will say a spoonful of raw organic honey is equivalent to 4 ounces of Coca-Cola, and I don't think that's equivalent evolutionarily. And the framework that I see that in is this whole food matrix and all the other things that are in the honey that really are like information. I think people should think about this as like packets of information on the internet, or light information, like getting vitamin D from the sun versus D from a vitamin D supplement. These are completely different things. We know that the sun contains more information coming to your body, and similarly, getting fructose in a strawberry or an apple or a tablespoon of honey is different than getting fructose in high fructose corn syrup. So let's segue to meat, because I think that there's a really interesting discussion here about the whole food matrix of meat as well, and the way that might influence how we respond to meat. So the flip side of the equation you mentioned earlier is the second part of this point that I want to discuss, which is there is a hypothesis that perhaps the consumption of meat in the setting of a quote-unquote healthy diet is due to protective effects of fruit and vegetables, which assumes that the meat has a negative effect on humans. And that's something that I'm not convinced of, but I want to talk about that a little more. But let's dig into that a little bit. I mean, when people think about meat and cancer, or what are the potential things in meat that you think the fruit and vegetables might be protecting us against?
Yeah, I mean, there's maybe, I would say this is somewhat speculative because we only have a lot of in vitro digestion data, right? And so how this would pan out in humans, I'm not 100% sure, but it's okay to speculate a little bit sometimes. but at least some of the in vitro data would suggest that, and again, this is a simulated digestion, that some of like heterocyclic amines or other compounds such as that may form with heating of meat, but it will also certainly help them if you heat your Brussels sprouts and glaze them. So it's not per se unique to meat, but with heating, compounds are formed, and then if you marinate your meat or use herbs and spices or citrus like lemon juice, that then the formation of these compounds is reduced by 30 to 60, depending on the study that you look at. So that could potentially be a reason why you offset some of these issues. But again, we don't really have much in the way of data of people such as people that have a meat heavy diet that do not consume a lot of other foods with it. So yeah, to say for sure, but at least that provides a mechanistic explanation that we touch on. But I would definitely not say or at least claim that is proven beyond reasonable doubt. It's just more of a theory, I would say, at the moment.
Yeah, I saw those papers. I dug into this a little bit because I think it's a topic that comes up a lot, and it kind of centers around this idea that some of the lipids in meat could be oxidized when you cook it, and that maybe adding things like certain herbs could ameliorate the oxidation of those lipids in the meat when you cook it. And the first thought I had was something that you referred to. Basically, if there's a lipid in any food and you cook it, you're going to oxidize it potentially. And that's one of the reasons that I recommend people do not cook with olive oil. I don't even think people should be using seed oils, but the more saturated an oil is, the less likely it is to undergo oxidation when you expose it to heat. This is just kind of basic general organic chemistry. And so this isn't unique to meat. This is just anytime you heat an oil, you are going to have some products of oxidation. But what I found interesting about this is that there are actually some interventional studies that show that the increase of red meat in a diet doesn't lead to increased oxidation or oxidative stress in humans. So like you're saying, I think we need some translational studies to really tell if this is a concern or not for humans. This is just one study that I've talked about a lot in the past. Admittedly, they're saying increasing lean red meat, so who knows how much fat is in this red meat, but this is a great study that I think should be shouted from the rooftops. I'm sure you've seen this one. Increased lean red meat intake does not elevate markers of oxidative stress and inflammation in humans. I mean, it's all there in the title. Like, red meat does not lead to inflammation. And in this study, they didn't talk about using any of these herbs to pre-treat the meat or anything like that.
It was for sure.
The other thing I thought.
No, go ahead. I was saying it was. I think it was in this particular study they consume meat as part of a healthier diet too, if I'm not if I'm not mistaken, right? So the idea is, and again, at the moment we don't have data on people on purely carnivorous diets, and I know that's maybe something that your listeners are interested in. So at the moment we have to deal with healthy omnivorous diets, right, rich in fruits and vegetables. But from what appears from those studies is that if you co-consume red meat as part of phytochemically rich fruits and vegetables, that you do not see, like, indeed the F2. This was measured in the plasma in this case, the oxidation products, that these do not seem to increase. And the mechanism behind it, again, we know can potentially
Okay, we're back. Go ahead.
We're back. All right. Where were we? Okay. Yes, we were talking about the study with meat as part of healthy diets. Indeed, that you do not see some of these oxidation products being formed. And as mentioned, at the moment, where people and us, like ourselves, have predominantly studied this as part of a healthy omnivorous diet that's also rich in phytochemically rich fruits and vegetables. And mechanistic data would suggest that some of these phytochemicals can maybe, these in itself at least that in my interpretation of the literature, and also what we're finding in our studies, is that these can have anti-inflammatory and antioxidant effects potentially. So it may, even if red meat had some effects with oxidation, these can be potentially be offset. And one thing I want to point out is that eating, co-consuming different foods to maybe get the good of one food, such as bioavailable nutrients, amino acids, zinc, iron, B12 for meat, taurine, and other unique nutrients, but offsetting potential detriment by consuming other foods as part of it, that's all as mankind. I think about people who used to consume with their potatoes before we bred all the because then they could get starch, right, and energy, glucose from the potato, but they had to consume it with clay so that they wouldn't get disease from that. Something like pemmican, like the natives did it. They probably don't know why, but they were like, okay, if we have dried meat and fat and we add a bunch of berries to it, this meat stays longer, probably because it didn't oxidize as much, right? So there's definitely some idea behind that of traditional wisdom. Now we're finding that it's sort of mechanistic data, and we need to study this more in humans. But there's definitely indication that the co-consumption of phytochemicals can maybe help you obtain the goods from the meat, but decrease these oxidation products that could happen with the oxidation of lipids, like you described. Essentially, the food just going bad in a sense, right?
Yeah, and let's go another level deeper here, and I think maybe we'll go 2 more levels deeper, but one at a time. The first level deeper, let's talk about the food matrix in meat and all of the unique chemicals in meat, because I think one of the things that often gets left out of this discussion is that there are unique chemicals in meat that might also protect us from products of oxidation. Things like carnosine and carnitine, and these are part of a meat food matrix. And this is the problem I have, or one of the problems I have with any of the products of meat cooking, whether it's heterocyclic amines, N-nitrosothiols, heme iron. When they're studied in isolation, you're only going to get those things in the context of eating meat. But the meat is going to come with compounds like carnitine, carnosine, we can talk about taurine separately, that have intrinsic quote unquote antioxidant ability. I mean, that have the ability to sort of like, I guess what I'm driving at here is, do you think there are actual compounds in the meat? And I want to talk about the phytochemicals in meat separately, but do you think there are actual compounds in the meat that could also be playing a role here that could be valuable?
I mean, it could be the case, and we do know, and we don't know as much about the pathways yet, but things like anserine and taurine, carnosine, these can all be potential, can play potential antioxidant roles. Like cysteamine is a precursor to glutathione, which is a main intracellular antioxidant. Taurine, and again, here we're getting into isolated compounds again, unfortunately, to study, so we don't know how getting those into a meat matrix impacts neurocognitive function. Randomized controlled trials, especially in older adults, combination of anserine and carnosine or taurine can have neurocognitive effects. So there's definitely something in there, and I do want to highlight several of these compounds can also be found in like so it's definitely not that meat is per se the only source of that. Anserine or red in this case, well, anserine is named after isolated from duck, or that's at least where it was first found, and the name derived from duck, just like taurine is derived from taurus, like beef, right? And so these are definitely found in other sources of red meat too, and often found in fish. Things like creatine also is found in fish as well. But these could potentially neurocognitive effects, and especially in critical life during growth and development at a young age, potentially at an older age, or another thing I'm particularly interested in studying is in moms that are breastfeeding, for instance, or nursing mothers or pregnant mothers. Like, what is the effect there, and is there a concern, or can it be beneficial when some red meat is ingested as part of that, right? So yeah, those are definitely interesting that need to be studied in the future. But yeah, meat contains unique that such as taurine and serine, creatine, that could have potential neurocognitive effects and antioxidant effects, and they could potentially be a reason why, especially with unprocessed meat, you see some of those benefits. But I would also say it's the extra stuff that you're not getting, right, when you eat. Obviously, eating sort of some muffin and egg, right, in like a processed matrix is going to be different than just eating a piece of red meat. And we can go into that deeper too. What we have recently found too is that what you feed the animal is another important mechanism. You can increase antioxidants in meat, which could also potentially decrease lipid oxidation, and at least what we're studying, that also decrease the formation of some of these compounds. It is sort of marinating the meat from the inside out, right, by what you feed the animal. So instead of putting that herbs and spices on the meat, we have the animal consume biodiverse vegetation, because a lot of these things, like acid or catechin or chlorogenic acid, right, very well known from garlic, catechin from green tea. Well, things can also become concentrated in the meat when the animal is consuming biodiverse forage. So you're already increasing the antioxidant compound in the meat when animals are grass-fed, particularly grass-fed a wide variety of plants.
Yeah, this is fascinating to me, and this is a study that I definitely want to dig into. Before we go there, I want to show one thing. If people have questions about red meat and cancer, I've done a whole podcast on this, multiple podcasts on this. I think this is a great review that I would recommend people look at. Red meat and colon cancer, review of the mechanistic evidence for heme in the context of risk assessment methodology. As the authors of this paper point out, the N-nitroso compounds formed from the cooking of meat are actually different than the N-nitroso species that have been found to induce tumorigenesis through DNA adducts. You can see here that they're usually nitrosothiol and other N-nitroso compounds. So there's different N-nitroso compounds formed when you cook meat, at least according to these authors. And then, as I stated earlier, the heme iron studies are often done in calcium deficient rat models, which are probably not super relevant. And as we've sort of hinted at before, the lack of a meat matrix for many of these studies is something to be aware of, and the potential that this is a real flaw in these methodologies. Yes, go ahead.
No, I think you hit the nail on the head there. That's such an important nuance, Paul, is that a lot of these studies, and that's why I'm also careful in stating some of those things, because this has been studied through a nutritional reductionistic lens, which is, okay, we see these nutrients like so you point out, often in the animal studies, they're as isolated compounds, and then these isolated compounds are the meat matrix, and therefore we draw conclusions from that. So there's some and that work is very important to get, but then it does have to converge also with some of the data that we see in randomized controlled trials, where clearly if you consume meat as part of a healthier diet, some reason to think that maybe these problems are somewhat mitigated, and there's at least some that is at least a hypothesis that within testing, because that does seem to be some plausible evidence to suggest that may be the case.
Yeah, I think that's very clear, and I think that the question that hopefully the research will help us understand is, and I think this is not even really a major question, but we can hopefully corroborate it with further research, is how much of that is the absence of ultra-processed foods or the presence of other foods. Because if we need to be eating meat with certain plants, we want to know that. But if we don't need to be eating meat with certain plants, we also want to know that, because that helps people make certain choices. Obviously, I'm sure you're somewhat familiar with my line of thinking and the idea that I'm not convinced that all parts of plants are always good for all people, but I will say that over time my perspective has kind of softened a little bit. But let's go to this study, which is something that you mentioned, and this one was really a game changer for me when I saw it, and I really thought it was cool that you guys did this study, that you and Fred Provenza and others had published the study, and I love that you said this. This is basically marinating meat from the inside out. Because one of the criticisms of an animal-based diet or a carnivore diet is that you are not going to get phytonutrients. And I saw the study and I thought, well, I guess if you're eating well-raised meat, which is something I'm a huge advocate for, grass feeding, grass finishing, I'm a huge supporter of farms like Belcampo, primal pastures. Here in Costa Rica, I even have access to grass-fed, raised meat through a farm called Grass-Fed Costa Rica, and there's cows literally outside my doors here. We were talking before the podcast. I got lost today on my way back from a gas station to the beach, and I picked up a Costa Rican guy on the road. He took me to see his bulls. You know, we had these toros, and he took me. And he was going to bring them to do some work, and there's cows everywhere here that are eating forage and eating some of the greenest grass I've ever seen. But how cool to think that consistent that what an animal eats actually accumulates in its muscles and in its organs, and that if we're eating foods that are proper food, eating a species appropriate diet that is a variety of plants, presumably on a larger field, this is another reason to advocate for regenerative agriculture, that the actual phytonutrients or the micronutrients composition of this meat is going to be very different.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right, Paul. And I came sort of from a human nutrition standpoint initially too, because if we feed humans a phytochemically rich diet, you can several conjugates of these phytochemicals in the urine. And also in animal data, if you feed rodents or lab rats and mice a phytochemically rich diet, these polyphenols end up in their brain, ends up in their liver, ends up in their muscle, right? So there's no reason per se to think that this wouldn't be the case in animals. And what you indeed see, and what we found, and this was a literature review, and we have more primary data that is going to be published pretty soon here too, is that, and we also saw it in another paper, which was a alternative, which you can maybe go in later. But anyway, I was looking at this data when I got it back, and I was like, why are all these plant compounds in our meat? And we tested grass-fed beef. But then obviously for me, it was also an aha moment, thinking that, well, it's not because we were sloppy with our sample processing and a bunch of grass was mixed with the meat. It was because obviously these phytochemicals from the forage are transferred from the forage into the meat and become part of the meat matrix and the milk matrix then. And what you clearly see is that the more bioforage is, so if an animal consumes 20 plants, 50 plants, or 100 plants on pasture, animals grazing monoculture pastures, which unfortunately is all too often sort of the case. Pastures, and we're doing on-farm research, and on one of the farms there's a lot of biodiversity. And then you look at the farm next door, and it's May. Well, by now it's August, but in May the pasture was already overgrazed and grazed down and lacking biodiverse forage. So that grass-fed meat, which can also be labeled grass-fed meat, is much less phytochemically rich than the animals raised on biodiverse forage. So grass-fed beef isn't grass-fed beef isn't grass-fed beef. There's huge variation. And then, but even if you compare it to animals finished in a feedlot on grain-based, they have the lowest amounts of phytochemicals. And there was definitely a nice study that looked at this already 30 years ago, because that's also the golden rule in science, right? If you can think of it, there's a good chance someone else has thought of it before you and done it in some sort of way. So they looked at some of these volatile compounds, which some of them could be classified into the polyphenolic class. And what they found was that when the animal goes into the feedlot, after 60 days, these phytochemicals are cut in half. After 120 days, they're further down, and you end up with a 3-4-fold reduction. And what we know is a lot of these individual compounds, we could detect them in grass-fed beef. We couldn't even detect them in grain-fed beef. So there's definitely a lot of these phytochemicals, and these are polyphenols. People think of it like, think of things like flavonoids, right? You associate it with berries, for instance. Well, these also are in meat and milk, and like acid, catechin from which is believed to be responsible for the health benefits of green tea. Well, when the animal consumes biodiverse forage, and then you can find these in the milk too, and we have research on it. But when we looked at the literature on some of the compounds in green tea, end of the spectrum of green teas, these compounds like catechin were found in similar amounts at the higher end of grass-fed milks, and then people don't think of this too. And I certainly don't want to make the case that that is always the case, because some green teas are much higher in this, and of course, plant foods are going to be higher in phytochemicals because you're diluting it right through a middleman, or in this case, a middle cow. But it's actually interesting to see that a lot of these compounds are being incorporated into the meat and milk, and these are at least presumed to have potential anti-inflammatory and antioxidant effects, and sort of indeed what you, as we alluded to earlier, marinating meat from the inside out and protecting against lipid peroxidation. And this will impact the inflammatory response to meat and milk. There has been some studies on it, and we have a randomized control trial going on to that. Yeah, that's what the future will have to find, whether this actually has a plausible health effect on us.
I don't have the study pulled up, but I know you've mentioned the study in the past, that there is an interventional study. Now, the metrics that they used were somewhat questionable, and the sample size wasn't large, but they compared the consumption of, I think, mainstream non-processed red meat to wild kangaroo meat. You know the one I'm talking about? And,
yep.
And it did look like the kangaroo meat had a different biochemical profile in the people that were consuming it. And I do not think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I do not think they were comparing the kangaroo to grass-fed, grass-finished meat.
No, it was, yeah, it's an ARIA study, 2011. And indeed, what the authors did was, this was a postprandial study. So what happened was participants came into the lab. They eat Wagyu beef, grain-fed beef, very fat, finished in feedlots, and they kangaroo, and they both consumed that. As I think they had some potatoes and peas with it. The thing that they changed was the meat. So people came in one, ate the meal with the Wagyu beef, came in another week, ate the kangaroo. Kangaroo foraged on native pastures. Presumably it was more phytochemical rich, and there's definitely been some work done on kangaroo to suggest that. The Wagyu beef, very less phytochemicals, and is that the inflammatory response. We always have a little bit of an inflammatory response after eating. That's completely normal and important in human physiology. But they saw a slightly, or they saw an increased inflammatory response with the Wagyu beef, and the idea, at least behind, than compared to the kangaroo meat, which was at a lower inflammation, IL-6 and C-reactive protein, TNF alpha. So the idea is that, okay, if you repeat that for multiple months, or you would probably potentially see a health effect. And another mind is one with pecorino cheese, which is cheese made from sheep milk. Pecorino, Sardinia, Italy, the sheep raised on biodiverse mountain pastures are amongst the most biodiverse pastures we find. We find this in our work too. We've done some work on with a rancher who raises his cattle in the mountains of Idaho. Glenn Elzinga is his name, Alder Spring Ranch, and he finishes animals on mountain pastures, and those are amongst the most phytochemically rich pastures. It's also been shown in France when the animals are raised on the Pyrenees. Well, anyway, the sheep cheese raised in Sardinia, from sheep milk raised in Sardinia, compared to a just commercially available cheese that was grain fed. They also showed that after 10 weeks, it was half a pound of cheese a week, that there was a lower, at least a chronic systemic inflammatory response. So we have two studies going on right now. We're looking at this short term. So replicating that kangaroo, with that kangaroo study was two different animals, and the fat content was different between the kangaroo meat and the beef. So now we're matching it for fat, grass fat versus grain fat. We also have a there as a third arm, see what the responses are. And we're also doing a long-term study with multiple weeks of consumption, seeing how that impacts multiple week low-grade systemic inflammation in a fasted state. So we're studying it post-meal response as well as responses to see if on paper the grass-fed meat look healthier, will it have a health benefit when consumed over time. We'll see.
Yeah, it's really fascinating stuff. It's very interesting to me, and it makes me wonder. And I think it's yet another reason to think about voting with your dollars for grass-fed, grass-finished, regeneratively raised beef. Maybe at the end of this podcast, we'll get into a little bit of the ethics of eating meat, maybe a little bit of the environmental stuff. I don't know if we'll have time today, but that's a reason that I feel so good about supporting these farms with this podcast, is that clearly these meats appear to be evolutionarily consistent and beneficial for humans in many ways. When I was with the Hadza, and I've joked that is my go-to refrain now, but I did spend 2 weeks with the Hadza in February of this year. They're always eating animals that are eating a very biodiverse type of diet themselves. Now, I want to say something because I think my audience will really find this interesting. My perspective on these chemicals has shifted a little bit over time. When I wrote my book, I sort of took this different perspective, and I thought, well, I'm not convinced that these polyphenols. And reading this study about phytochemicals in beef that you published was one of the main things that got me thinking about this. And I thought, maybe they're not so bad for us after all, but maybe I would prefer to get them from an animal that's more evolutionarily adapted to eating them than I am. Because I think of these herbivores as these sort of large plant processing facilities that have millions of years of evolution in their phase 1 and phase 2 detoxification to sort out which of these compounds are harmful and detoxify some of these compounds and sort out, because I think that some of these phytochemicals may be beneficial for us, and some of them are very clearly plant defense chemicals that are trying to do harm to us. And so I've been sort of thinking about this and mulling it over. It was one of the reasons I was looking forward to this conversation. But the way I see it now is like, maybe there's an argument to be made for, you're getting a salad in your meat when your meat is eating grass-fed, is grass-finished, and regeneratively raised. And so I thought that was quite interesting, and I do think that at least my hypothesis might be, or where my mind has gone now, is like, maybe these compounds aren't harmful for us, or maybe it's just beneficial to get them via proxy of an animal that's already processed them properly as an evolutionary herbivore. I kind of come back to this. And as you know, I'm not sure how familiar with my work you are, but I've become a fan of fruit in the last few years. Originally, I must say that I was one of those zealous people who thought, no, fructose is bad for humans. I too was misled, and I will fully admit that I've changed my mind and evolved and continued to learn over the last few years. So I don't fear fruit, but I do see some sort of a difference between fruit and, quote, vegetables. Those often get lumped in. And I see vegetables as like the leaves and the stems and the roots of plants, along with the seeds, quote unquote. And I see these, this is just my perspective. You may not agree, and I'll certainly get your thoughts on this too. These are all phytochemical rich, but these are the parts of a plant that plants don't want to get eaten, quote unquote. And so the question that I kind of ask is, how evolved are we at detoxifying these chemicals or processing these chemicals from these parts of plants versus fruit, which is something that it seems, if I squint my eyes plants a little bit, that plants actually want us to eat. So you and I had talked a little bit about this offline, but I'm building an animal-based research, animal-based nutrition research foundation, nonprofit, and I hope to be able to fund in the future studies that kind of ask this question. This question is very interesting to me. I'm not sure mainstream medicine is super interested in this question, but I do have an interest in the difference between fruits and vegetables as part of a complete, quote unquote, healthy diet. I see a healthy diet as a diet that is evolutionarily consistent, that is free from the processed food that we talked about earlier, seed oils, processed sugars, that is eating all of the foods in a whole food matrix, or the vast majority of them. Nobody is perfect. And then this question of fruits versus vegetables is an interesting one for me, because I do wonder, and I would love to see an experiment in the future with a quote animal-based diet where people are eating fruit and honey and meat and organs, but they don't have the vegetables. Are they going to get more inflammation from a group with vegetables, the same or less? So that's just kind of the framing. I just wanted to offer that to my audience because I wanted to share how my views are kind of changing on this. And people can also refer back to the debate that I had with Alex Leaf. That was a good friendly debate. But he kind of said to me in that debate, Paul, so you're not actually worried about plant chemicals. What you're worried about is plant defense chemicals. And that was a good characterization. I find it interesting that there are defense chemicals in plants, and I think we should be aware of this and try and understand where within the hierarchy of foods we should place vegetables, that is stems, roots, leaves, and seeds versus fruits. I think we both agree, and many agree, that meat and organs are an essential part of any healthy human diet. So I rambled. I'll let you respond to that in any way that you would like.
Okay. Now I want to, Paul, is that what I think maybe vegetables require more out-of-the-body processing in order for them to become safe to eat, right? Like fruit, you can just pick them off a tree and eat them. Well, try to consume a bean and you're not going to be happy, right? So these can go through extensive processing of like sprouting, fermenting, pounding, and what people used to do to that all the time, right? And we've fallen for this so many times where nixtamalization is very common in traditional cultures. Then we took corn back to Europe and everyone got pellagra, right? And why was that? Because we thought, well, we don't have to process the corn. We could just eat it like that. So I would think that with some of these compounds, some of the oxalates in some green leafy vegetables with cooking, there can definitely be increase its ability to digest and absorb. And of course, they're going to be inter-individual differences. I mean, some people may be more sensitive to it than others, right? Like some people eat broccoli and they're completely fine. Other people eat broccoli and they're get gut distress or things like that, right? So there's definitely also individuality. But I agree also with the point that you make, and it's definitely an interesting hypothesis, is that there's certainly overlap with some of the phytochemical compounds that are found in the plant kingdom. You can get many flavonoids from potatoes. You can get them from berries, from certain plant or certain vegetables too. So there's definitely sort of an overlap. But one thing I do want to offer is that, and you see this, and acknowledging the limitations of associative data, but there's also some randomized controlled trials on that topic, is that dietary diversity ends up being selecting from a wider variety of does seem to increase the variety of phytochemicals that we get into our body, and also is associated with better health. But again, we could argue that sometimes people that will select more, it's may or may not other potential health effects. But that's also an interesting thing to look at in the future, as we see with the animals too. If the animals are able to select a wider array of plants on pasture, they end up with a higher amount and wider variety of phytochemicals. And what I think is particularly unique with the animals is, and why that can be used as a way of increasing the phytochemicals in our diet, is because animals consume vegetation that you and I cannot consume, right? So we may be able to get some more unique compounds like, for instance, alpha and beta pinene, which are also found in some plant essential oils. But pinene, named after the pine tree. You and I don't eat pine trees, but animals, it's all. So when animals are eating a lot of sagebrush, they can incorporate some of these terpenes that could have potentially health promoting effects in our body. So those are just some thoughts, and we need to do more work, better understand it. And also one thing I'm very interested in too is that the bioavailability is getting some of these compounds from animal source foods. Does it change when we get them from plant foods? Because probably in the animal source foods there's and anti-nutrients is, I don't like to use the term because it's what can be an anti-nutrient can also be bad sometimes, and it's definitely not as black and white. But it may not come with some of the inhibitory compounds in foods, but certainly there's other ways of getting rid of some of these compounds in such as soaking, for instance, can get rid of a lot of phytic acid, right? And sprouting, and you might reduce phytic acid in beans by 80 to 90%, in which case maybe it is safe for consumption for many people, because obviously that beans and legumes are consumed widely in the world.
Yeah, you bring up a great point that, and this is something that I have also talked about in the past and in my book, that the consumption of plant foods historically has often been with greater degrees of processing, whether it's fermentation or soaking or sprouting, and that I think is a pretty clear indication that there is some degree of I'm not sure what word to use there. You'll probably object to my use of the word toxicity. I would say toxicity. We could say that perhaps the nutrients are more bioavailable, but that there's a real precedent for this processing of these foods. And I will say that from my perspective, sometimes often the processing reduces some of these compounds that could be detrimental to humans, but doesn't reduce them completely and doesn't affect some of them at all. For instance, phytic acid, is not completely reduced. Oxalates, get rid of. Lectins, pretty difficult to get rid of unless you pressure cook something. And those are something I have significant concerns about, definitely with beans and other lectin-containing foods. So there's an interesting line of thinking there. And for me, at least in my schema, the paradigm that I begin to construct is like, I do see a hierarchy of foods arise, and I think, okay, why are people eating beans? And if they could hunt animals, would they eat beans? I wonder. The Hadza, this is just one example, but the Hadza don't really go looking for leaves and seeds unless they don't have meat. So I was like, okay, that kind of makes sense. That certainly will eat some fruit every once in a while. There was a baobab tree outside of camp, and when they were bored, they would go over to the baobab tree and throw some rocks at it and eat some baobab fruit. And the women would often dig tubers, which we would eat and then spit out the quid because there's so much fiber. There's so many fibrous little strands in the tubers that you can't actually eat them. And then when we got honey, we would eat without any regard for the amount of calories in the honey, but they didn't really go out picking like pumpkin leaves and things like that when I was there, or any real vegetables. So I wonder, I would like to go back and spend more time with them and spend more time with the Ikung in Botswana and Namibia. And of course, these observations are limited, and I want to be careful about that, but I do think that they are consistent with this sort of hierarchy of foods in terms of what we're looking for as humans. But this idea that phytochemicals can be found in meat, and that if your food is eating a more diverse diet is quite unique. Do you want to start talking? You mentioned a study. Do you have any more comments on this? You're welcome to offer them, but I would love to talk about the research you're currently doing and the metabolomics study that you mentioned, comparing real meat and plant-based meat, because plant-based meat is such it's a hot topic right now, and my audience will have there will be no confusion about where I stand on this topic. But can you talk about the metabolomics study that you did with plant-based meat versus regular meat? And obviously you can offer any other thoughts you have about what I was just mentioning as well.
Great. Yeah, no, we can dig into that study for a bit. So yeah, what we did was we compared grass-fed beef to a popular plant-based meat alternative that was soy-based. The reason why we chose grass-fed beef, a lot of people ask me, why did you choose grass-fed beef? Well, the reason why we choose grass-fed beef is because both types of quote-unquote beef are considered more environmentally friendly and healthier options sometimes, at least by the consumer. They're also roughly in the more comparable in terms of price point, right? Grass-fed beef and plant-based alternatives, which are even at the moment a little bit more expensive than grass-fed beef. So that was the reason why we chose grass-fed beef. Environmentally friendly. We run metabolomics, and metabolomics is a technique that allows you to look a large number of small molecule food samples, and these can be things like amino acids, fatty acids, peptides, phytochemicals, carboxylic acids, you name it, a whole wide variety of metabolites, and many would be considered nutrients. Also vitamins and mineral derivatives, and carotenoids. So these techniques. to that. And we really went beyond the nutrients that appear on food nutrition labels. On the nutrient facts panels, we see up to 30 nutrients appearing. USDA database, food database, does a little bit better job and tracks 150 components in foods routinely, but foods in the natural state contain hundreds to thousands of metabolites that are potentially capable of impacting human health, many of which do not appear on nutrition facts panels. So for a consumer that picks up a plant-based meat alternative or a package of beef, will look at the vitamins and minerals and the protein content and the fat and think, this plant-based meat contains similar nutrients based on these nutrition facts panels. Now, we were interested in going beyond that and looking at sort of the whole food matrix. So we run our metabolomics approaches, and we found a 90% difference in metabolite abundance. So 90% of the metabolite either in higher or lower amounts in the beef or the plant-based meat alternative, and vice versa. About 60 metabolites were either unique to the beef or the plant-based, meaning that some were only found in the beef, others were meat alternative, which suggests that these products are not nutritionally interchangeable when studying the whole food matrix. And, we certainly found potentially beneficial compounds. We found things such as taurine, anserine, creatine, carnosine, etc. in the, not taurine because the specific method that we used did not allow for identification of taurine, but we know it's in there. But creatine, anserine, cysteamine, a bunch of other carnosine, a bunch of other metabolites that can have potentially antioxidant and neurocognitive effects. But then on the other end, in the plant-based meat alternatives, we found certain isoflavones, other phenolic antioxidants in there, genistein, diacetyl, also different amounts of vitamins and minerals. But the point being is we cannot determine from the data if one to the other, and that's also beside the point. The point is that what we found is that these are not nutritionally interchangeable. It is not even an apples to oranges comparison. It is a meat to soy comparison. They're about as different as you would expect meat and soy to be. So that is important, at least for consumers to note, is that because oftentimes we label these things as protein foods, right? Just because they contain proteins that they're nutritionally interchangeable, but protein comes with a wide variety of other nutrients. So this work was really aimed at studying the whole food matrix and seeing if there were differences or similarities. And we found quite substantial differences and concluded that plant-based meat alternatives are not one-to-one nutritional replacements.
And this is yet another organ meats, because if you look at this food matrix of an organ, like a liver or a heart or a kidney or a testicle, and you compare it to muscle, they're completely different. They're probably more similar than soy and grass-fed meat, but muscle meat and liver are very different. And liver is very different than heart, is different than kidney, is different than pancreas, is different than spleen. And so this is why, why I built Heart and Soil, why I think consuming organs is so valuable. And I don't know, do you know anyone that's done any of this research looking at sort of the whole food matrix of organs and the unique sort of compounds that are in organ foods? And if not, hopefully we can do it in the future.
We're have some data on that, and I can. It's not published yet, but I'll give you the scoop. Liver contains higher amounts of these phytochemicals and antioxidants, about like 2 to 3-fold higher the amounts. Like if you look at the total amounts, so they're definitely richer in these phytochemicals. So it seems like indeed we're studying this in grass-fed beef. Raising biodiverse pastures, they're picking up a bunch of phytochemicals in their muscle meat, but they pick up higher amounts in the liver for sure. So these get concentrated at higher to a higher. What we haven't been interested in doing is, so this is a targeted phytochemical assay. So we're specifically studying phytochemicals, polyphenolic compounds, carotenoids, tocopherols. Within the subclass of phenolic acid, we look at things like hydroxybenzoic acid, hydroxycinnamic acids, which are the main classes of polyphenols. And then we go deeper into like indole compounds and terpenes and etc. But those are higher in organ meats. So that's another way, linking it back to our previous discussion. these polyphenols get incorporated into a higher amount in organ meat. So it's more nutrient dense, not only in terms of vitamins and minerals, it also concentrates these phytochemicals to a higher amount. And so that's one of the things that we found. And then also potential, which is something you can measure using a specific assay like a ferric acid assay or as an FC assay that looks at the total antioxidant composition that is also higher. So yeah, there's definitely a higher amount of these phytochemicals appearing. But to that point, what I do want to do also is run more of an untargeted approach and look at maybe like 1,000 or 2,000 metabolites in muscle and in liver, and then look at unique compounds in there that unique peptides that may be found in liver that are not found in muscle meat, and vice versa. So
the peptides are particularly interesting to me. So these are not phytochemicals. Now we're talking about these less than 50 amino acid sequenced, less than 50 amino acids in these peptides that have unique signaling roles. And then you can go down an amazing rabbit hole and you think like, what kind of peptides are found in heart? What kind of peptides are found in kidney? And could these have a unique role for human health? What kind of peptides are found in the brain? When I was with the Hadza, we ate baboon brain. And yeah, so I find all of this to be quite fascinating. And then you ask these questions that are particularly interesting to me, which is like, what kind of peptides are found in testicle? And how does a man how does it affect a man to eat cow's testicles or bull balls? I just went to Cobano here in Costa Rica the other day, and I bought some bull balls, and we have a new supplement from Heart and Soil called Whole Package with desiccated testicles, and it seems to be quite powerful. So this is all super interesting stuff. These peptides are, I think, somewhere that we really need to explore. We had a little, who knows what happens, we had a little technology thing. But yeah, you said you had some more thoughts about organs. What are your thoughts about organs?
Well, what was interesting about these things that we know play a role in human health, such as taurine, which is particularly rich in the heart, CoQ10, also rich in the heart, right? We know there's also play a role potentially in heart health and we again notice mainly from animal models in rodents, but there's no reason to assume they wouldn't play a role in heart health in humans too, right? So what is interesting to see is that some of these nutrients that play a role in our specific organs, such as heart health, are also most richly expressed in the same organ of the animal. So that's certainly an interesting hypothesis that we need to study more. And but yeah, you do see that there's this sort of overlap with the nutrients appearing in organ meats, and then these nutrients ubiquitously expressed in our organs too. So that's definitely an interesting thing to look at. And but also I must say it is good that you're using the whole animal, because I just think out of respect for the animal, that is also the right thing to do, to consume as much from the animal as possible, right? Because I don't really per se do research into the ethics per se. Some of the people I work with, like Fred Provenza, is more well versed into that. But the short end being is that if you consume more of the animal, just out of respect for the animal, I think that's a great thing to do. And there was actually a study out of Germany too, is that suggests consuming more organ meat, consuming more of the animal, would already just by nature produce potentially the greenhouse gas emissions, the CO2 equivalents expressed per kg of beef, right? Just because you're consuming more of the animal, because we usually think of it as like retail cuts, and you're consuming 60% of the animal, but another 20% of the animal, organs, bones, skin, are perfectly consumable too.
Yeah, it makes sense from so many different perspectives. I believe that when this podcast comes out, I will have released the previous two podcasts with Alex Epstein and Patrick Moore. If you guys are interested in the sort of environmental impacts of meat, the sort of a deep dive into climate change in general, which was quite eye-opening for me, and the environmental changes that the Earth has undergone over the last few 100 million years. Please listen to those podcasts. It'll help put all of this into context as well. So we've kind of touched on this a little bit throughout the podcast, but tell me a little more about the current experiments you have going on in your lab, because I'm really excited to hear the results of these. And I think these are exactly the type of research that we need.
Great. So we have a 4-week randomized controlled trial going on. It's a crossover design, meaning that every participant will consume 2 diets. One diet is red meat in the context of what we call traditional American diet, rich in the also often vilified potato, but also rich in fruits and vegetables, full-fat dairy, nuts, and things like that. And then we're comparing that to a more standard American diet, rich in ultra-processed foods. So same amount of beef, similar foods, but in one case they might come into more of a packaged matrix, and the other case maybe more of an unpackaged matrix. So think of it as that you're consuming some steak or beef patty with green beans and potatoes. Well, what happens if you consume that beef patty with some potato fries, for instance, and some green beans in comes in a packaged version, right? Like what happens then? Or you consume broccoli and some cheese, or you consume broccoli and cheese sauce and things like that. So we're really matching the types of food that we're eating, and we're looking at this because many perspective or at least associative data would suggest that consuming red meat, as we talked to in the beginning of the podcast, consuming red meat as part of a healthy diet seems relatively benign for health. So these associations with heart disease and cancer and metabolic disease become largely neutral. When you consume red meat as part of an ultra-processed diet, that's where you run into issues. So we are studying that prospectively in a randomized controlled trial. And I don't have a lot of data to share yet because we're wrapping up a study. What I can tell you is that one group is improving their triglycerides and quite a bit in 4 weeks from pre to post. I can put my chips into what group it is, but we'll see which group it is. I think it's the whole food diet, but we'll see when we get the final data back. But in any case, one group is improving, their triglycerides go down, cholesterol, what we see typically is that their HDL cholesterol changes a bit, goes up a bit, LDL maybe goes down a bit, but cholesterol will probably take longer than 4 weeks to change, but we do see some changes in the triglycerides. And at the end of the study, we'll also look at inflammatory profiles, interleukin-6, C-reactive protein, and one thing we're also looking at is we're using metabolomics approaches to look at the metabolites that circulate in our blood. About 50% of what circulates in our blood is directly related to our diet. And we can use these metabolites to look at metabolic pathways, such as disease pathways, which may be either enriched and be indicative of maybe like mitochondrial dysfunction or other impaired glucose tolerance and things like that. So we're studying whether eating high amounts of red meat, and it's relatively high because it's daily consumption of red meat, whether this modulates the cardiometabolic risk factors. And of course, there are going to be limitations of the study because we're not comparing it to a diet that is exclusively in plant foods. We're also not comparing it to a diet that is only containing red meat, right, like a carnivorous diet. So those are obviously some limitations and will require future work. But yeah, it will be interesting to see if that modifies the risk factors with red meat, if we consume it as part of a healthy diet versus a quote-unquote unhealthy or standard American diet.
I think that is the first piece to establish this. I think that we need to establish in the nutrition sphere very clearly that when eaten in the context of a healthy diet, red meat and organs are incredibly health promoting for humans. And that's what you and I believe. We will wait for further research to corroborate that. I think evolution shows us that. Anthropology shows us that. There's already studies that show us that, but we need more data. And then I think from there, we will have to ask the more detailed questions, which is what part of the healthy diet and what part of the standard American diet are so damaging, because it sounds like in your standard American diet, people are going to be having processed food, which is going to be certainly much higher in linoleic acid, although I don't know. It would be interesting to look at levels of linoleic acid in those two diets. Presumably those the French fries are cooked in some sort of vegetable oil. And so I wonder about that kind of stuff too. So there's a lot of details. And this is why nutrition research is so hard, And I think the studies need to be constantly refined. So we say, okay, what about this variable? What about that variable? And so that we can really give people clear direction in the future and say, hey, this is what we know. And we'll create health in a human. But I think that the most important thing is that red meat is not vilified incorrectly, and organs are not vilified incorrectly because they're clearly very healthy for humans, or at least that's what we both believe very strongly.
Well, at least what I would say is what I think, based on the literature, is that they're at least not disease-causing. Let's just say that there's a reason to assume that they're not disease-causing. And whether they are truly health-promoting, I mean, they contribute strongly to nutrient adequacy. So by that token, they can be health-promoting, I guess, if we look at it from that lens. But yeah, the next future steps would indeed be sort of trying to tease apart those, right? Like, what if we have a dose responsiveness of consuming even more red meat, and how does that impact things? So there's certainly many questions to be answered, but I agree that we first need to sort of start from the basics and just evaluate what happens when we consume red meat as part of quote unquote, healthy omnivorous diet versus a quote unquote unhealthy omnivorous diet, which being the standard American diet. And we, in our study, we call it the traditional American diet because we selected the same number or the same type of foods, right? So we're not studying this per se as part of a Mediterranean diet or a traditional Japanese diet or anything like that, which are often touted as healthy diets, which, by the way, are also omnivorous. They always consume moderate amounts of animal food, so we certainly shouldn't forget about that. But yeah, that is an important baseline to establish. What happens if we co-consume those with phytochemically rich foods? Can we at least offset, if there are negative effects, right? Can we offset those? And then the next question indeed would be also, what if we marinate that meat from the inside out by giving these animals phytochemically rich diets? Gray-fed liver versus grass-fed liver. There, really, in liver, you see large differences for sure. Everything seems to be amplified in the liver in terms of micronutrients, but also in terms of phytochemicals.
In that study that you're doing, are you measuring fasting insulin?
We are, yeah. It's not changing to a great degree so far in both of the groups. So, but we are measuring fasting insulin there. But it's, the diet that we're looking at, it is also, rich in whole grains, rich in potatoes and things like that. And it's also not a weight loss diet. I want to stress that too, is that we try to keep our participants at weight maintenance as much as possible. And so far you could do that with a whole foods diet, because definitely one of the things that we're running into is, and that's also suggested for Kevin Hall's study, when let's say people tend to want to consume a little bit more on the ultra-processed diet, but then have trouble hitting the same amount of calories on the traditional diet. So I'm not sure if we can totally uncouple the effects of the health-promoting effects of such a diet rich in fiber and rich in whole foods from its caloric intake, just because a lot of people struggle with hitting those caloric numbers that they would otherwise easily hit on a standard American diet. So.
And I would suggest that, again, my hypothesis would be that these endogenous cannabinoids would be playing some role in that as well. And I guess there's two sides to that coin. Is a whole foods diet more satiating because it's more nutrient rich? I think that's probably the case. Is it more satiating because there's more fiber? I'm less convinced about that based on the research. The research that I've seen with high fiber diets and weight loss is not incredibly compelling. I think that I had a friend growing up who was an Army Ranger, and he said that they would starve them for a number of days in their Ranger indoctrination school, and they underfed them, and the guys would eat toilet paper and then just drink water so that they would have something in their stomach to fill it up. But as we know, that doesn't really, that's essentially to me what you're doing with fibers. You're just expanding it in the stomach. There's a whole separate podcast on fiber, guys, if you're curious about that. But I think there's a lot of these nuances, and hopefully we can start to kind of pick them apart and look at them individually, because I do have a lot of concerns about linoleic acid, and I do wonder how much of a role it's the phytochemicals as a protective role versus the absence of other things. And then, like we talked about, are there enough phytochemicals in the meat to give a benefit as well, and is the quality of meat affecting things? There's so many interesting experiments. The last thing I'll mention, and then I'll we can wrap it up, is that there are, when I've looked at these studies, there are a number, and I've talked about these studies at length on previous podcasts, there are a number of fruit and vegetable, and this is fruit and vegetable together, depletion studies that don't actually show significant negative effects in humans. So that to me is interesting, and it makes me wonder how much of it is phytochemicals versus the absence or presence of certain oils. Basically, what I was saying was that there are these fruit and vegetable depletion studies where you can remove fruit and vegetables from people and they don't have increased oxidative stress or markers of DNA damage. So that's quite interesting, and I think it raises a lot of questions, and I think we need to sort this out. Or, the question is the meat they're eating providing them enough of these phytochemicals, or what's really the determining factor here? It's an interesting set of research, and I look forward to more of it. And the study that I really want to see done is with an animal-based diet. It's like meat and organs and fruit without the vegetables, and how that affects people. So hopefully we'll do that study in the future as well.
Yeah, no, that's a very interesting thing, and I definitely think that there's definitely overlap between fruits and vegetables. I do want to highlight, Paul, is that phytochemicals, we do get them through animal source foods, but they are about 5 to 20-fold lower than if we get them directly from plant foods. Now, we don't know about the bioavailability yet, but if that's different, right, if maybe some of the plant inhibitory compounds are reducing the bioaccessibility, and there we get into nuances like fermentation, sprouting, and things like that, which will have an impact. But with animal source foods, could that change the bioavailability? But I think here's the main thing, is that it represents an avenue by which additional unique phytochemicals are ingested, because animals consume plants that you and I cannot consume. So it's a way of increasing the diversity of these compounds. But yeah, I agree that with your hypothesis, it's a plausible one that consuming these with a decent amount of fruits could also be the case, and whether the absence of vegetables, or maybe some vegetables that may be a little bit easier to digest typically than maybe some of the brassica vegetables or legumes versus let's think of zucchini or something like that, right? Which appears to be lower in some of these inhibitory compounds. So those are also important nuances. But yeah, ultimately, the end of the day is that I think the best advice to give to people is that you also have to know your body a little bit, right? If every time you eat broccoli, you run into gut issues, then yeah, you probably shouldn't eat broccoli, but you can get these nutrients from other sources too, right? And if you enjoy eating broccoli, then go for it eating broccoli. And the same with certain meats too, right? Like if you enjoy eating fish and shellfish, then you'll get a lot of the same nutrients that you would get in meat, right? And so those are also important things to note, is that we do see it, like if you study 20 humans, you get 20 different responses almost, to an extent, right? And I think we need to do a better job in research too, to highlight those individual differences. And that's why I think we shouldn't approach this from a one-size-fits-all approach, which I think is something that can sometimes plague nutrition science, is that we extrapolate certain findings in a group of people and then say, okay, this is how everyone should be eating. And I think we have to be very careful with that, particularly in nutrition science, we allow for that freedom, and also respecting cultural traditions and things like that.
Yeah, it is an interesting question how much variability there is between humans, because the flip side of that line of thinking is we're all Homo sapiens, and are we more alike in the way that we should construct a diet, or could construct a diet for optimal health, than we are different? I always kind of wonder, sometimes when people go down that avenue, I'm not saying that you're saying this, but they'll then follow up with a statement like, maybe vegan diet is just better for some humans than other humans, and a meat diet is good for some humans. And I kind of think, I don't think there's that much difference in the way that Homo sapiens nutritional biochemistry works. We're all Homo sapiens. But that's just my perspective. So
let me ask you one question then, Paul. There's definitely a lot of people that do appear healthy on vegan diets, whereas other people may run into issues with their health. I think maybe it might be certain genetic differences or inter-individual difference in nutrient metabolism. We need more data on that. But is it because the people that do feel good on it just designed their diet better? Or is it because they truly cannot thrive on it. And the same then on the opposite end of the spectrum is that with meat-based diets, some people seem to do well on it, and maybe other people maybe don't. What do you think can maybe explain some of these inter-individual differences?
Yeah, so this is a very interesting thing. I'm not sure how you would study this, but I would love to see it formally studied. In the first paper that we talked about today, you actually mentioned a statistic that I thought was fascinating, which is that there are 5 times more former vegans and vegetarians than there are current vegans and vegetarians, and that the majority of these people did the diet for less than 12 months. So again, I think that this will, I want to be as careful as I can about my intrinsic bias, but I do believe that a Homo sapiens organism is not adapted to a plant-based diet in any way, shape, or form. We don't see any historical cultures ever doing that. Certainly plants are much more available than animals and easier to procure. And so if you could be a plant-eating human and thrive on that, I would imagine that we would have at least seen one culture historically that did that, and we've never seen one. And there are examples of species of hominids, specifically Paranthropus robustus, that went extinct and based on stable isotope analysis appear to have been mostly plant-focused. So there's a lot of lines of evidence to make me think that. Further down the rabbit hole, when people say they're thriving on a vegan or vegetarian diet, those are 2 different things, right? A vegetarian diet has milk and it has eggs. That's a completely different situation.
Yeah, I agree. And it's an omnivorous diet.
It's an omnivorous diet. And I know a lot of people who say they're vegetarians and they eat fish. So let's just contrast a vegan diet and an omnivorous or an animal-based diet or a carnivorous diet and create a spectrum there. So when people are vegans, I've just seen it too many times. And perhaps this is my confirmation bias, but I've seen so many examples of people who, may say they're thriving at 1 year or 2 year on a vegan diet, and pretty predictably at 4 to 5 years, their hormones go in the tank and they absolutely crater nutritionally. I've interviewed Elise Parker and Tim Sheaf on my podcast and talked to so many vegans who are really badly damaged from long-term vegan plant-based diets. And so to me, I just haven't ever seen it happen. And so when people in the space say, hey, I'm thriving on a vegan diet, I think, I'm glad you're doing well. I'm not convinced that you're going to last with that. I don't understand the reasons you're not eating meat. That's why we do what we do, trying to convince people that meat is evolutionarily consistent, both ethically and environmentally sound, so that people can actually lead healthy lives. But then there are very long-term prominent vegans, and they appear to be thriving. And the examples that often get put out there, I just wonder sometimes, is this reality? And perhaps this is not fair to suggest, but I just wonder, how either they're eating a huge amount of quote-unquote processed plant-based food, taking a huge amount of synthetic supplements, neither of which is very evolutionarily consistent, or they're sneaking in salmon from Alaska and eating it once or twice a month, and that's actually allowing them to in their mind believe they're being more ethically consistent. What I hear from vegans all the time is I cannot speak my truth because my community will destroy me, and my entire life is built around this. And again, this is all conjecture, but I've had physicians email me and say, I've been a vegan for 20 years, my health is destroyed, I've built a career, a community around this. If I come out and talk my truth, I will be literally cannibalized. Not literally, but you know what I mean, in the social media space. And so they can't do it, and they start eating meat and they never tell anyone. And this is what I fear. So this is, again, I don't think that we'll ever understand this and why we need formal study, but I just don't believe I don't believe it's tenable. And I think that these examples of high-profile vegans that often get thrown around as quote-unquote thriving, I think, they don't often look that great to me, and how much better would they be with meat? And I just really hope that they're telling the truth and not misleading people, because that would be hurting a whole lot of people. The flip side of your question is, what about people who don't thrive on meat-based diets? What I've seen is that generally, and again, there is a bias here. People with chronic kidney disease don't do well with more protein. So that type of a person isn't going to do well with a heavily meat-based diet. And perhaps I don't see a lot of the people who don't thrive on meat-based diets, but I will admit that when I was doing a fully carnivorous diet, I felt better with the addition of some carbohydrates from an electrolyte perspective. And I personally found that long-term ketosis was very hard as a human, as my human entity, a year and a half. So maybe there's individual variation on how people tolerate ketosis. Perhaps there are examples, and if people know of examples of people like this, I would love to hear their stories and understand maybe where it goes wrong. I certainly admit that there's got to be some degree of bioindividuality, but I don't hear of a whole lot of people not doing well on a paleo diet or an autoimmune paleo diet or an animal-based diet. And I would think of those three things as nodes on a continuum, with like less vegetables, less vegetables, less vegetables. So again, I'm sure there are people out there who go animal-based and eat meat and fruit and don't do well, and I wonder what's going on there. But again, I think that there's a whole lot more people who are going to thrive with meat and organs in their diet than not. Is that a reasonable answer to your question?
I think so, yeah. No, I didn't mean to put you on the spot, but it's also a fascinating topic to me, and I always like to hear different perspectives on that, because, yeah, we don't have answers to a lot of those questions yet. So, but yeah, sort of my view on this and my interpretation of the literature is that, yeah, I think most people tend to fall on some spectrum of omnivory, right? And incorporating various amounts of plant and animal foods. And certainly on that spectrum, we can vary, and, we could potentially go without either one for a substantial amount of time and probably be fine. But yeah, it's certainly very interesting. And like I said, you have many different people with many different responses. Where I always get a little bit, what I always sort of caution against, and that is again sort of my personal opinion, but also obviously based on the literature that I read. In that is that I think we should be careful when people are. You can be healthy on a Mediterranean diet, you can be healthy on a ketogenic diet, you can be healthy on. You see people healthy on a Nordic diet, on a vegetarian diet, some people maybe on a vegan diet, some people on a carnivore diet. I think we just have to be careful in extrapolating findings of certain groups to how entire populations should eat, and I think that's the main thing. And so that's sort of my takeaway on that. But it was very interesting to see sort of certain responders and non-responders in response to certain diets, and I'm sure we'll find the occasional oddball. And we see that in different populations, right? Northern Europeans, Caucasians, when they consume the standard Western diet, they run into metabolic health issues, but it takes them longer to run into metabolic health issues than when maybe someone like the Pima Indians or something like that, which have been studied in that regard, or Samoans. If you put them on a standard American diet, their health, their metabolic health worsens much quicker than some of the Western Europeans. So there definitely seems to be inter-individual differences also in the way we metabolize nutrients, right? And so yeah, it's just definitely a fascinating topic to study in the future, and why some people seem to do well on certain diets and other people do not do well on certain diets.
Yeah, I think it's an important series of questions for us to be asking. And I think it's also important for us to, I've always found it important in my work to ask questions, right? To think outside of the box a little bit, to look at what things we're assuming. And I have traditionally felt that the assumption has always been that plants are benign and good for us, and we should eat more plants. And so it's been fun and interesting to kind of question that, and honestly, to change my opinion and shift my ideas on that over time. But I think that there is value in asking that question and saying, are all plants always good for people? I think that the majority of people out there, when they have any sort of health issue, if they get any sort of nutritional advice, it will be eat more plants. And I don't think that that's the answer for a lot of people.